He showed up alone. They laughed. Then the most powerful woman in the room walked past every CEO, every millionaire, every man with a title, and chose him. What happened next silenced an entire ballroom. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel small by people who mistook your quietness for weakness, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, and if this one moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The suit was 3 years old. Liam Parker knew that the moment he walked through the revolving doors of the Meridian Grand Hotel and caught his reflection in the polished brass frame, the slightly too wide lapels, the jacket that pulled just a little across the shoulders because he'd been leaner when he bought it, back when he still had time to think about things like that. He'd had it dry cleaned the week before, pressed it himself that morning at 5:30 while Gracie was still asleep, and he'd stood in the narrow hallway of their apartment holding the iron with the kind of focused, deliberate care he gave to everything that mattered. He was aware that it wasn't the right suit. He was aware of a lot of things he couldn't change. He straightened his tie in the reflection and walked in anyway. The Aurora Ventures annual charity gala was held every November in the Meridian Grand's main ballroom, a cavernous space of cream marble and gold-trimmed columns, where chandelier light pooled in warm circles across tables dressed in white linen, and the quiet clink of crystal glasses underscored conversations about money, leverage, and who was sleeping with whose CFO. Liam had attended 3 times now, always on the company invitation list as a mid-level financial analyst, always alone, always vaguely aware that his presence was tolerated in the way a piece of adequate but uninspired office furniture is tolerated, useful enough to keep around, too unremarkable to notice. He checked his coat at the door, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray because he wasn't drinking tonight, and moved along the edge of the room toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Chicago in November was the color of an old bruise from up here, purple and gray and gold, where the streetlights caught the wet pavement 40 floors below. He stood with his glass and looked out at it and thought about Gracie, the way she'd made him turn around 3 times before he left so she could examine him from every angle, her small face serious with the weight of her inspection. "You look handsome, Daddy," she'd finally declared with the gravity of a Supreme Court ruling. "You think so?" "Mostly." He'd laughed at that. He was still carrying the warmth of it when the voice hit him from the left. "Parker, you actually came." He turned. Derek Solon was standing a few feet away with 2 other men from the firm, Marcus Webb and Jason Chu, both of whom were wearing suits that cost more than Liam's monthly rent. Derek was Aurora Ventures' senior portfolio manager, a 40-year-old with the particular brand of confidence that came from never having to worry about the gap between what you earned and what things cost. He was also, in Liam's experience, the kind of person who mistook cruelty for wit. "I always come," Liam said. "Yeah, I noticed." Derek's eyes tracked down and up in a single practiced sweep. "Still flying solo, huh? 3 years running. That's some kind of record?" Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Jason looked at his phone. "Just me," Liam said. He kept his voice even. "Must be a choice," Derek said, in the tone of someone who believed the opposite. He raised his glass. "Or condition. Hard to say." "Derek, Jason said with the half-hearted protest of someone who'd seen this before and knew it would continue regardless. "I'm just saying, man. It's a charity gala. Half the room brought a date. The other half brought someone they're trying to become a date." Parker shows up with his sparkling water and his... He paused, and his eyes settled on the suit with visible pleasure. His classic taste in tailoring, every year, like clockwork. He shook his head slowly, wearing the expression of someone performing sadness. "That's commitment to the bit. I'll give you that." "Is that all?" Liam asked. "I'm just making conversation." Liam looked at him for a moment, long enough that Derek's smile flickered just briefly, and then looked back toward the window. "Enjoy your evening." He started to move away. He heard Derek say something to the other 2, low enough to be deniable, and then he heard Marcus laugh, a short, sharp sound, and he kept walking because there was no version of turning around that served him. He'd learned that a long time ago. He'd learned a lot of things the hard way. He found a table near the edge of the seating area and sat down, setting his water glass on the white linen and pressing his palms flat against his thighs for a moment. A steadying gesture. He'd developed it sometime in the last 8 years, around the time his life had been rearranged without warning, and he'd had to find new ways to stay level when the floor moved. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who was 8 and fierce and occasionally terrifying in her perceptiveness. He worked 2 jobs, his analyst position at Aurora Ventures, 45 hours a week, and a freelance financial consulting practice he'd built on evenings and weekends. The work he did at the kitchen table after Gracie was asleep, the work that was slowly becoming something, though he hadn't told anyone at Aurora about it because he wasn't sure how they'd receive it, and he couldn't afford to take that kind of chance right now. He'd been doing this for 8 years. Not the 2 jobs, but the alone part. The raising her alone part. Emma had left when Gracie was 6 months old. Liam still didn't have a clean, simple way to explain it to people because it hadn't been clean or simple. It had been slow and then sudden, a marriage that had started with genuine feeling and ended with a note on the kitchen counter and a suitcase missing from the closet. Emma wasn't a villain. She'd been 23, terrified, postpartum, in ways she didn't understand, and ultimately unable to stay. Liam had spent a year being furious about it, and another year grieving it, and then somewhere in the 3rd year, he'd stopped trying to fit it into a narrative that made sense and just gotten on with being somebody's father. He was good at it. He didn't say that with any pride or self-congratulation. It was simply something he knew to be true in the same way he knew other practical facts about himself, like that he was good at reading financial patterns and bad at remembering to eat when he was working and occasionally talked to himself while doing dishes. He was good at being Gracie's father. It was the thing he was most sure of in a life that had a lot of uncertain edges, but it had costs. It had permanent, ongoing costs that didn't show up anywhere on a balance sheet. He hadn't been on a date in 2 years. The last one had been a disaster of mutual exhaustion. A woman named Claire, who was also a single parent, also working too much, and they'd sat across from each other at a restaurant and talked for 3 hours about their kids and their schedules, and neither of them had had the energy to pretend there was anything else. She'd texted him the next morning, "I think I'm not ready for this." He texted back, "Me either." And that had been that. He didn't come to events like this hoping to meet anyone. He came because the firm expected attendance and because occasionally the networking produced something useful, a contact, a conversation, a thread he could follow up on in some professional capacity. He came because he decided years ago that withdrawing from the world because it was inconvenient wasn't something he was willing to do. He had a daughter watching how he handled inconvenience. That mattered to him more than he could articulate. A woman at the next table caught his eye and smiled politely in the way people do at formal events, then looked away. He smiled back. Around him, the ballroom was filling up. The low current of strategic conversation, the air-kissed greetings of people who'd seen each other at the last gala, and the one before that, the careful choreography of a room full of people performing their most useful selves. He watched it all with the detached observational quality that had always marked him, the thing that made him good at financial analysis, the ability to sit slightly outside of a system and see its patterns without being fully inside it. He could read a room the way he read a balance sheet. He saw the hierarchies, the alliances, the small dramas unfolding in real time between people whose proximity to wealth had not necessarily improved them as people. Derek was across the room now, holding court with 3 women who were laughing at something he'd said. Marcus was standing near the bar, scrolling his phone. The events program sat on every table in a cream envelope, and Liam opened his and read through it without particular investment. Remarks by the Aurora Ventures Executive Board. A presentation of the Foundation's annual charitable initiatives. A keynote from the evening's featured guest. A name he recognized. Isabella Hartwell, founder and principal, Hartwell Capital. He'd heard of Isabella Hartwell the way most people in finance had, which was to say, he knew the outline of her without the detail. 30 years old. Had built her first investment firm at 24 using a combination of inheritance she'd doubled inside 18 months and a public reputation for being genuinely, sometimes inconveniently smart about where capital went and why. Hartwell Capital was now a mid-sized but growing force in impact investing. The kind of firm that mixed serious return expectations with actual accountability for where the money landed. She was on magazine covers occasionally, which he tended not to read. She was known for being direct and somewhat impatient with performance. He folded the program back into its envelope and set it down. Across the room, the laughter at Derek's table had grown louder, and he could tell without looking that he was the subject of it. He could tell because Derek had that specific projection quality to his voice when he was performing for an audience, and because he caught the phrase sparkling water and a sad tie carrying across the space between them. He stood up. He'd meant to stay at least through the opening remarks. He told himself he would, the same way he told himself a lot of things that required more from him than they should have. Just get through this part, then the next part, then the part after that. But there was something about tonight, the 3-year suit, Gracie's mostly, the hour-long bus ride to get here because his car was still in the shop, the fact that it was a Tuesday and he had a 6 a.m. call tomorrow with a client who would definitely not have done the prep work Liam had asked him to do. All of it had settled on him in a way that made the idea of standing in this room for another 2 hours feel genuinely impossible. He picked up his coat check ticket from the table. He'd drop a donation at the desk on his way out. That was the actual point of the evening, and he could do that without staying for the performance. He moved toward the main entrance with his head up and his pace unhurried, navigating between tables, keeping his face neutral, the way he'd learned to do when he was moving through situations that required he not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing that they'd landed. He was 20 feet from the double doors, tall, gilded, just beginning to swing open from the other side as the next wave of arrivals came through. When Derek's voice reached him one more time, carrying across the ballroom with the ease of someone who'd never once worried about being overheard. There he goes, every year, classic Parker, shows up, stands around looking lost, leaves before anything actually happens. Man's like a human screensaver. The laughter that followed was not unkind in the way of people who didn't mean it. It was the deliberate laughter of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Liam stopped. Not because he was going to turn around, not because he had anything to say. He stopped because something in him needed one single moment to just feel the weight of it, name it internally, acknowledge it the way you acknowledge a bruise before deciding whether to press on it. You're tired, he said to himself. You're allowed to be tired. It doesn't mean anything. He took a breath. He started moving again. And then the doors opened. He didn't see her at first. The doors opened wide, and there was the usual small commotion of a significant arrival. Security personnel, a publicist, 2 assistants in dark blazers, and then the crowd at the entrance shifted and a murmur moved through the near side of the ballroom, the way sound moves across water. He was close enough to the entrance that he should have stepped aside. He started to, moving left to make room, and then she was there, and she was looking directly at him, not past him, not at the room behind him, at him. She was wearing a dark blue dress, not the kind that was trying hard, just the kind that fit someone who'd stopped needing things to try hard on her behalf, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it herself in under 3 minutes, and it had somehow come out looking correct. She was shorter than he'd imagined, which was an odd thing to notice, except that he'd pictured her from magazine covers where scale was always distorted. And in person, she had the specific quality of someone whose size in a room had nothing to do with their height. She moved through the small cluster of her own staff with the ease of someone who'd learned to exist in crowds without being consumed by them, and the room did what rooms always did when someone of her particular gravitational pull arrived. It reoriented. Conversations paused. People turned. The CEOs and board members who'd been angled toward the entrance with their professional smiles ready, straightened slightly, prepared. She didn't look at any of them. She looked at Liam. He had a fraction of a second to process this, to wonder if he was misreading it, if she was looking past him, if this was some elaborate coincidence of geometry. And then she was crossing toward him with the specific intentionality of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has already accounted for the obstacles. And he stood there holding his coat check ticket like an absolute fool and couldn't think of a single appropriate thing to do with his face. "Sorry I'm late," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected. Clear. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see that she had a small scar through her left eyebrow, the kind that comes from a childhood fall and never quite fades, and that she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read at all, warm and assessing and somehow both serious and slightly amused all at once. She slipped her arm through his. He stood there. "I told you I'd be your date tonight," she said. The sentence was perfectly calibrated, loud enough to carry, natural enough not to sound like a performance, landing in the room with the easy precision of someone who understood exactly the acoustics of what she was doing. The laughter stopped, not gradually, not the slow fade of humor running out of steam. It stopped the way a switch gets thrown, complete, immediate silence where there had been sound, and then the new and very different sound of a ballroom full of powerful people recalibrating in real time. Liam Parker looked at the woman standing beside him with her arm through his, wearing the most composed expression he had ever seen on another human face, and thought, with complete clarity, "I have absolutely no idea what is happening right now." "Hi," he said. It was not by any measure the right response to the situation, but it was what he had. The corner of her mouth moved. "Hi," she said back. And then she turned toward the room, toward the CEOs and board members who were still frozen in their moment of recalibration, toward Derek Solon, who had gone the specific shade of pale that expensive men turn when they realize they've badly miscalculated something. And she smiled. "Shall we?" she said to Liam. He looked at her. He looked at the room. He thought about his coat check ticket. He thought about Gracie saying mostly with that devastating 8-year-old sincerity. He thought about the bus ride over and the 6 a.m. call and the dry-cleaned suit that was still 3 years old and still didn't fit the room. He put his coat check ticket in his jacket pocket. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." "Ma'am." They walked into the ballroom together and the room parted for them in the way rooms part for people it has decided matter, and Liam was aware with a strange, detached clarity that something had shifted in the atmosphere around him in a way he didn't understand yet and probably wouldn't for some time. He was also aware that the woman whose arm was through his was a stranger, a complete stranger, who had, for reasons he could not begin to articulate, just walked through a door and rearranged his entire evening. The nearest table had 3 people at it who visibly wanted to come speak to her and were holding themselves back out of some social calculation he didn't have the map for. A man in a gray suit, who Liam recognized vaguely as a senior figure at some mid-sized hedge fund, was watching them with an expression of pure, undisguised confusion. Derek, visible across the room, had turned his back and appeared to be very carefully inspecting a floral arrangement. "You don't have to do this," Liam said quietly. He kept his voice low enough that it stayed between the two of them. She looked up at him. He had about 4 inches on her, with an expression that was evaluating something. "Do what?" "Whatever this is, I was actually leaving." "I know, I saw." A pause. "And you?" "Decided I'd prefer not to spend the next 2 hours networking with men who've already decided I'm more useful as a photo opportunity than a business partner." She said it with the flatness of someone stating a logistical fact. "You were the only person in the room who looked like they were somewhere else in their head." "I was thinking about my daughter." Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not performed. Just a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, the way a room changes when a door opens somewhere. "How old?" 8. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She's with my neighbor. She made me turn around 3 times before I left so she could check my suit. She sounds smart." "She's terrifying," he said, and something in his voice when he said it, the specific warmth that only sounds that way when it's real, made Isabella Hartwell look at him for a moment with an expression he still couldn't read. "I'm Isabella," she said. "I know who you are." Most people lead with that. Most people are trying to impress you. And you're not. "I'm trying to figure out what's happening," he said honestly. She almost smiled. "That's fair." A man materialized at her elbow. One of her assistants, a young guy in a dark blazer who handed her a small card and murmured something in her ear. She read the card, said something back in a voice too low for Liam to catch, and handed it back. The assistant disappeared. "I have to make rounds for the first hour," she said, turning back to Liam. "Speeches, handshakes. The structure of these things doesn't change, but I'd rather not do it alone, if that's agreeable to you." He looked at her. Liam Parker was not by nature an impulsive person. He made decisions carefully and carried them out completely, and had long since made peace with the fact that this made him slow in rooms that moved fast. He had learned that slow and careful, done consistently and with integrity, compounded over time. He believed that. He'd built his whole quiet life on believing that. Standing in the Aurora Ventures charity gala ballroom next to a billionaire he'd met 40 seconds ago, he did the math on this situation and came up with, I genuinely do not know where this goes. But the answer to the last 2 hours has been no to everything. Maybe one yes, tonight, to something I don't understand yet, costs me nothing catastrophic. Agreeable, he said. She nodded once, briskly, with the air of someone who'd expected this but hadn't assumed it. I'm getting a drink. A real one. Do you want anything? Sparkling water. She looked at him. Really? I have a 6 a.m. call. She gave him a look that could have been many things and landed somewhere near fair enough, and they moved together toward the bar. Quote, the first 30 minutes were the strangest of Liam's adult life, and he'd had some genuinely strange ones. Isabella Hartwell, it turned out, was exactly as direct in conversation as her professional reputation suggested, which was to say she said what she meant, she didn't fill silence with noise, and she had zero interest in the performance of pleasantry for its own sake. She shook hands and made small talk when required and did it well, but the moment the requirement passed, she turned off the performance with a cleanliness that Liam found genuinely startling. Most people in rooms like this never fully turned it off. They maintained the pitch even in the gaps, keeping the marketing running in background. She didn't do that. When they weren't actively being approached, she was just there, present, watching the room with the same slightly outside quality he recognized in himself, that habit of observing the system rather than being absorbed by it. You know Derek Solon, she said at one point. It wasn't a question. He's a senior manager at my firm. He's the one who was doing the bit about the screensaver. Liam looked at her. You heard that from the entrance. I heard enough. She took a sip of her wine. Is it always like that with him? With some version of Derek? Yes. And you just leave, he said. That's my usual move. Tonight I was executing it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Why don't you say something back? Because he's a senior manager at the only firm that's paying me consistently right now, Liam said. I have a daughter and a mortgage and a car that's currently in the shop, and being right in an argument with Derek Solon isn't worth any of those things. It came out more plainly than he'd intended. He didn't usually say this kind of thing to people he didn't know. He wasn't sure what it was about her directness that kept pulling the equivalent out of him. Some conversational principle of matching pressure. She looked at him. That's a very practical answer. I'm a very practical person. Is that a complaint? Just a fact. She set her wine glass down on a passing tray and picked up a different one, and Liam noticed that she hadn't actually been drinking much of either glass. She was rotating them, which was the move of someone who wanted to look like they were participating in the ritual without actually participating in it. He filed that away without comment. You work 2 jobs, she said. He went still. Not obviously. Not in a way she would necessarily catch. But something in his chest closed down a fraction. The instinctive wariness of someone who's had the details of their life used against them in ways they didn't anticipate. How do you know that? He said carefully. She turned to look at him directly, and her expression was clear and undefensive. I've read your work. My work. The Community Financial Literacy Project you've been running online, the quarterly analyses on your personal site. You've been publishing for 18 months, and you have about 400 regular readers, which is approximately 400 more than most people working at your firm's level think to reach. She paused. You're also Maplewood Financial's mystery consultant. I've been following that firm's turnaround, and your fingerprints are on several of their restructuring decisions. Silence. I didn't advertise that, Liam said. No, that's part of what made it interesting. He was quiet for a moment, processing. Around them, the ballroom continued its orchestrated flow, the clink and murmur, the performance of importance. And he stood in the middle of it, feeling the specific disorientation of having something private held up to the light by someone he'd met less than an hour ago. Why were you following it? He said. Because I spend a significant portion of my time looking for signals, she said. Not the loud ones. Those are easy. The loud ones are everywhere. The quiet ones, the work that's being done without the press release attached to it, that's harder to find, and it usually tells you more. What did it tell you about me? She considered the question. That you're careful. That you think in second-order effects. You're not solving for the immediate problem. You're solving for what the immediate solution creates downstream. And that you do it consistently, which means it's not style, it's structure. It's how you actually think. He looked at her. He started. Accurate, she said. I was going to say unsettling. Also possible. She glanced across the room. Solon is watching us. I know. He has been for the last 20 minutes. Does that bother you? Liam considered. Not as much as it would have before you walked in. He paused, which is probably the point of what you did at the door. She was quiet for a moment. Then, partially. What's the other part? She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that was different from the clean, managed clarity she'd worn most of the evening. Something slightly less composed, slightly more real, the way a face looks when it decides to stop editing itself. I'll tell you that later, she said. If the evening goes a certain way. And before he could respond to that, a hand landed on his shoulder from behind. Heavy, hearty, the grip of someone announcing their own importance through their palm. And he turned to find Robert Vance, Aurora Ventures co-founder, standing there with the expression of a man who has recently had to recalibrate several of his assumptions and hasn't fully recovered. Liam, Vance said with a warmth he hadn't deployed toward Liam in approximately 3 years of working for his company. Good to see you, and of course, he shifted to Isabella with a smile that cost him something. Ms. Hartwell, we're honored, truly. Robert, she said. Her tone was pleasant and exactly as warm as required and not a degree warmer. Good event. Your foundation's mental health initiative. The numbers from last year were impressive. I'd like to talk about the data behind the community impact metrics before we leave tonight. Vance blinked. Of course, absolutely. I'll have my... Not your assistant, she said. You, 30 minutes before the keynote. She said it the way you tell someone where to meet the car. Not unkind, just definitive. Vance said, of course, again in a slightly different voice, and excused himself. Liam watched him go. He turned back to Isabella. Do you do that to everyone? Do what? Tell them what you want without giving them space to negotiate. I give them space to say no. He wasn't going to say no. No, she agreed. He wasn't. Liam looked at her for a moment, and he was aware, with the mild, slightly helpless quality of someone watching weather change, that he was deeply, genuinely curious about this woman. Not the magazine version of her, not the financial reputation, the actual person who rotated wine glasses she didn't drink, who noticed work done without a press release, who had walked through a door tonight and done something generous and strategic and possibly also something else, and who had said, I'll tell you that later in a way that stayed with him the way unexpected things did. Your keynote is in 40 minutes, he said. I know. Are you nervous? She looked faintly surprised by the question. Why would you ask that? Because you've been rotating that wine glass without drinking it for 20 minutes, and when Vance came over you set it down and forgot to pick it back up. She looked at her empty hand, then at him. I don't get nervous, she said. Okay. She stopped. Tried again. I get very aware of the gap between what I want to say and what the room is prepared to hear. That's just nervous with better vocabulary. She looked at him. He held her gaze because he'd said it and he meant it, and he wasn't going to walk it back. She laughed. It was a short sound, sudden, not performed, the kind that escapes before the performance mechanism can catch it. She covered it almost immediately with the composure she wore so well, but he'd seen it, and she knew he'd seen it, and something in the space between them shifted in a way he couldn't name but could feel. You're strange, she said. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. I know, he said. That's why I didn't argue. At 8:45, she excused herself to prepare for the keynote, and he stood in the emptied space beside him, watching her cross the room with the same clean, purposeful movement she'd come in with. And he became aware, gradually, with the slow, sinking quality of a realization you'd been circling without landing on, that he'd stopped thinking about leaving somewhere around the 20-minute mark. He picked up his sparkling water from a nearby tray. He stood by the window again, looking out at the city, the bruised purple of the Chicago November dark, the gold of the wet streets. And he thought about patterns and second-order effects, and work done without a press release, and a woman who called nervous by a different name. Behind him, he heard Derek Solon's voice, close and carefully arranged into something casual. "Didn't know you two were acquainted." Liam didn't turn around. "We are now," he said. He heard the pause that followed, the sound of someone recalculating. He kept looking out of the window and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular sensation of being in exactly the right place, for reasons he didn't yet understand, at exactly the right time. The keynote started in 35 minutes. He wasn't going anywhere. The evening was just beginning to show its shape, and neither of them knew yet how much the other had already changed the terms of what the night would mean. What would come next would test both of them in ways a ballroom couldn't contain. Isabella's keynote lasted 22 minutes. Liam stood near the back of the seated crowd and watched her the way he watched most things, with the quiet, lateral attention of someone more interested in what a thing revealed than what it announced. She was good at this, not in the way of someone who had been coached into good, but in the way of someone who'd been doing it long enough that the coaching had burned off, and what remained was just her. She spoke without notes, which he noticed. She made eye contact with specific people in the crowd rather than the practice sweep that most speakers use to create the illusion of connection without actually making any. She said one thing about 3/4 of the way through that made him set down his water glass. "Capital is not neutral," she said. "Every investment decision is a values decision, whether you name it that or not. The money goes somewhere. What we need to stop pretending is that somewhere is not our responsibility." The room applauded in the careful, hedged way of people who agreed with the sentiment and were uncertain about the implications. Liam picked his glass back up. When she came down from the small raised platform, she moved through the crowd with the controlled efficiency of someone extracting themselves from a situation that would consume all available time if she let it, and she ended up beside him with the relieved exhale of someone who'd held their breath for 22 minutes and was finally able to stop. "That was good," he said. "The third section ran long." "Only to you. The room didn't notice." She pulled at the fabric at her wrist, a small, restless gesture, the first visibly restless thing he'd seen her do, and he understood then that the keynote had cost her more than she'd shown. Not in confidence, in some other currency he didn't have a name for yet. "You said I get very aware of the gap between what I want to say and what the room is prepared to hear," he said. "What was the gap tonight?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the room, the reassembled crowd, the conversations reconstituting around them. "What I actually wanted to say is that most of the people in this room make investment decisions based on relationships and familiarity rather than evidence and call it strategy, and the communities that absorb the downstream effects of those decisions are not in this room and never will be." She said it flatly, without heat. "But you can't say that from a podium to the people writing the checks." "You could," Liam said. "You'd just lose half the room. The half I'd lose aren't the ones I need." "Then why not say it?" She considered this with the genuine engagement of someone who'd asked herself the same question. "Because there are things you can accomplish by staying inside the tent, and things you can only accomplish by burning it down. I'm still trying to work out which category this particular tent falls into." He looked at her. "And in the meantime, you rotate wine glasses you don't drink and give keynotes that are about 80% of what you actually mean." The corner of her mouth moved in that way it had, the almost smile that came and went before it fully arrived. "You have a very specific kind of directness," she said. "You started it." "Did I?" "You walked through a door and told a room full of strangers we had a prior arrangement," he said. "That's not the behavior of someone who does subtlety for its own sake." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the event was entering its later phase, the structured portion giving way to the looser, more dangerous part of the evening, when the open bar had been doing its work long enough that the professional masks started slipping and the conversations became more honest and more unwise simultaneously. "I saw you from the car," she said. He waited. "We were pulling up to the entrance. I could see through the window, the lobby glass. You were coming through the revolving door, and there was a group of men near the entrance laughing, and I could tell from the way you were standing that it was directed at you, and I could tell from the way you kept walking that it wasn't the first time. She paused. I've been in that room before. Not the same room, but that experience of walking into a space and being the thing the room decides to practice its superiority on. I know what that looks like from the outside. He was quiet for a moment. You've been the thing the room practices on. I was 24 and I was in a board meeting and I was the only woman, and I was also, as it turned out, the only person in the room who had actually read the full prospectus. She said it without bitterness, just factual. They called me sweetheart once. I corrected them and they called me difficult. I made them 12% in 14 months, and then they stopped calling me anything except the name I gave them. And then you walked into tonight and saw someone who knew how to keep walking, she said. Yes. Liam held his glass and looked at the middle distance and felt the particular sensation of having a thing about yourself seen clearly by someone who had earned the angle. It wasn't comfortable. It was something else. Something that sat closer to being known than he'd been in long enough that he'd stopped expecting it. That's, he started. I'm not explaining myself, she said quickly, and there was something almost defensive in it, the instinctive pullback of someone who'd gone further than they'd planned. I don't usually do that. The thing at the door. I want to be clear that it wasn't a habit. I know, he said. You don't know. You met me an hour ago. I know because you're telling me it wasn't a habit, he said. People don't explain the things they do routinely. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, and he saw the very slight tension in her jaw that was the only external evidence of whatever recalibration was happening internally. You're going to be difficult to read, she said. Probably, he agreed. They found a table in the quieter rear section of the ballroom, away from the main social current, where the light was slightly lower and the conversations from neighboring tables were indistinct enough to provide privacy without isolation. It was the kind of table you ended up at when you wanted to talk, rather than be seen talking, and Liam suspected she knew exactly which table that was in every room she walked into. She'd acquired a sparkling water of her own, which he noticed and didn't comment on. He just shifted his own glass slightly to make room for hers on the table, and she noticed him noticing, and neither of them said anything about it. Tell me about the community project, she said. Not the public version, the one you actually think about at 2 a.m. He looked at her. You know about the 2 a.m. thinking. Everyone doing real work knows about the 2 a.m. thinking. He set his glass down and looked at his hands for a moment, a habit he had when he was deciding how much of something to give. It started because of a family on our street, he said. Single mother, 3 kids, working 2 retail jobs. She came to me. She knew I worked in finance, with a stack of paperwork that a payday lender had given her, and she asked me to explain it. I explained it. The rate was criminal. She'd already signed. He paused. I couldn't undo what she'd signed, but I could explain it in language she could actually use, so she understood what she was dealing with and could plan around it instead of just being surprised by it. And I thought, another pause. There's a version of financial literacy that assumes the person already has a foundation, a vocabulary, a basic working knowledge of how credit and debt and equity actually function. And then there's the version that starts from zero. The version that says, here's what a compounding interest rate actually means in terms of your specific life. And the second version is what you built. I built a website, he said. I write analyses and post them. I run a comment section where people can ask questions. Once a month on a Saturday, I do a 2-hour session at the public library on the Northwest Side, budgeting, credit, reading a contract, what to actually look for in a financial product. He shrugged. It's not scaling. It's not... He stopped. It's not what people think of when they think about impact at scale, she said. No. But the Maplewood restructuring. He was quiet for a moment. How much do you actually know about that? Enough to have questions. He looked at the table. Maplewood was hemorrhaging, bad debt load, operational inefficiencies that had been masked by their growth period and then became visible the moment growth slowed. Their board was looking at bankruptcy or a brutal acquisition. A former client of mine had a board seat, knew I'd been doing the literacy project, asked if I'd consult on the restructuring plan. He paused. I spent 4 months working evenings and weekends on their debt structure. The plan I designed, it kept 83 jobs. Small number by most metrics, but they were union jobs, good wages, the kind of employment that anchors a neighborhood. You didn't file for credit on the outcome. It wasn't my company. You could have used it as a case study, as a credential. I could have, Jat, he said. I didn't. She was looking at him with the fully engaged quality of someone who'd stopped performing attention and was just actually paying it. Why not? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the work was the work, he said. I didn't do it to have done it. I did it because it needed doing, and I could do it, using it afterward to build my own profile. It would have been within my rights, but it would have felt... He looked for the word. Extractive. She was quiet for a long moment. Do you know how rare that is? She said. Not as a compliment, as a genuine, slightly frustrated question. The tone of someone who has spent years looking for something and is irritated by how seldom they find it. Rare doesn't mean exceptional, he said. It just means the incentive structures are built wrong. Yes, she said, and something in her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before, something that sounded like relief. That is exactly what it means. He looked at her. The low light of the rear section caught the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the small scar through her left eyebrow. She was looking at the table now, turning her water glass slightly in its place. That rotation habit again, the physical tick of a mind that didn't switch off. You've been building something, he said. It wasn't a question. I've been thinking about building something, she said carefully. What kind of something? The kind that doesn't exist in its current form. A foundation structure. Investment and support. Specifically targeted at working families. Not charity. Not the condescending version where you hand someone a fish and feel good about your humanitarian impulse. Actual structural support. Access to capital, financial education, employment stabilization, the connective tissue between someone who wants to build something and the systems that normally exist only for people who already have resources. She was speaking faster now, with the slightly compressed quality of someone who thought about this too much to be comfortable with the pace of normal conversation. The problem with most impact investing is that it's built on traditional investment logic, return timelines, scaling metrics, the assumption that what works in one context replicates cleanly in another. Families don't replicate cleanly. Neighborhoods don't. People's actual lives are inconveniently specific, Liam said. She stopped, looked at him. That's the phrase I use, she said, with a strange expression. Because it's accurate. I've never heard anyone else use it. Then we've been thinking about the same problem from different directions, he said. The quiet that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Not absence of sound, but presence of something that doesn't have a word yet. He was aware of it in the way you're aware of a change in air pressure before a weather shift, something that registers in the body before the mind has caught up. Liam. The voice came from directly behind him, and he knew it before he turned. Derek Solon was standing 2 feet away, with Marcus Webb at his shoulder, and the expression on Derek's face was a particular one, studied, careful, doing its best to look relaxed and not quite managing it. The recalibration was visible. He had the look of a man who'd spent the last hour revising an estimate. Didn't want to interrupt, Derek said, and the word interrupt did a lot of work in that sentence. Acknowledging the conversation, acknowledging Isabella, establishing that he'd noticed how long it had been going on. Then don't, Liam said. A pause. Derek absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was eating something he'd rather spit out. Just wanted to say, good event tonight. Ms. Hartwell, really strong remarks up there. Really. Thank you, Isabella said. Her tone was the exact temperature of someone who has given you what you asked for and nothing else. We were actually hoping, Derek started, and then his eyes moved to Liam, and something in the movement had the quality of a calculation being completed. That we might have a chance to speak with you before the evening wound down. The team has been working on an infrastructure proposal that I think would genuinely align with some of the themes you raised. Send the proposal to my office, Isabella said. We review external submissions on a rolling basis. My associate handles intake. She turned back to Liam. You were saying the second-order effects on neighborhood employment stability. Derek stood there for 2 full seconds. Marcus touched his elbow. They left. Liam watched them go, then looked back at Isabella. You didn't have to do that. I know. He's going to make my next 6 months at Aurora complicated. Is that a concern? He thought about it honestly. Less than I would have expected, he said. Something in her expression settled. Not satisfaction, something quieter than that. The particular quality of someone who's confirmed something they hoped was true but weren't certain of. She picked up her water glass and held it without rotating it, which was new. Tell me about Gracie, she said. The shift surprised him. Why? Because you've mentioned her 3 times tonight, and each time your voice does a completely different thing, and I'm curious about the person who makes that happen. He looked at her and felt himself make the decision he always made when this came up with people he didn't know well, the choice between the edited version and the real one. He gave her the real one. She was born in December, he said. Emma, her mother, left the following June. Gracie was 6 months old. She doesn't have any memory of that time, obviously. The whole early part, me figuring out how to be both people at once, the first year where I genuinely didn't know if I could do it. She doesn't know any of that. He paused. What she knows is that we read together every night before bed. She gets to pick the book every other night, and I pick every other night. And we have a rule that we have to at least try 3 pages of each other's choices before we're allowed to complain about it. She picks things about animals and space, and occasionally deeply disturbing chapter books about orphans. I pick things about history, and she tolerates them better than I deserve. Isabella had her chin resting on one hand, listening with the full stillness of someone who doesn't listen that way to very many things. She has Emma's eyes, he said. I spent a while not knowing what to do with that. Now I think it's just her face. It's Gracie's face. Emma is a separate thing that I carry differently. He stopped. I don't know why I told you that. Because I asked about Gracie, she said, and you're honest when you're asked something directly. Usually. What's the exception? He looked at her. When honesty has costs I can't afford. And right now? Right now, he said carefully, I'm talking to someone who has no leverage over me and nothing to gain from the information, which is a genuinely rare position to be in at an event like this. So, he picked up his glass. Apparently I talk. She was quiet for a moment, then, I haven't told anyone about the foundation concept. What I told you tonight. I've been developing it privately for 8 months, and you're the first person who's heard the actual why. Because everyone I've discussed anything adjacent to it with has immediately tried to figure out how they fit into it. And you think I won't. You turned down the opportunity to use a successful restructuring as a credential because it felt extractive, she said. I think you probably won't. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the tall windows, Chicago had deepened into full night. The city settled into itself. The lake somewhere beyond the buildings dark and cold and enormous. Inside, the gala had entered its long, comfortable exhale. The room loosened and warm. Conversations stretching into the territory that expensive alcohol and proximity to other people's wealth tend to produce. At the table where Derek Solon was sitting, something had shifted in the arrangement. Marcus Webb leaning in, Derek's head bent at the angle of someone calculating something. Liam clocked it without dwelling on it. It's getting late, he said. I should check in with my neighbor. Gracie gets anxious if I don't call before 9 when I'm out. Of course. She said it without hesitation, without the social performance of protest. He pulled out his phone and shot a quick text to Mrs. Okafor next door, checking in. All good. And received back almost immediately a photo of Gracie asleep on Mrs. Okafor's couch with her mouth slightly open and one sock on. He turned the phone and showed Isabella without quite deciding to. She looked at the photo. Her expression did something he wasn't expecting, something unguarded and genuine, the way faces look when they react to something before the management mechanism engages. She sleeps like that, she said. One sock? Every single time. We have lost an entire drawer's worth of single socks across 8 years. Isabella handed the phone back, and she was smiling. Actually smiling, not the controlled expression she deployed for professional occasions, but something that started in her eyes and arrived at her mouth a half-second later, slightly uneven, slightly crooked, real. It was the first time he'd seen it. He thought, with the helpless, half-stupid clarity of someone who's just noticed something they won't be able to unnotice. There she is. "I'll walk you out," she said. They gathered themselves from the table. He left a donation envelope at the event desk on the way, because that had been the point, and she noticed him do it but didn't comment, which he appreciated. At the coat check, he retrieved his jacket and helped her into hers without thinking about it. A habit formed from years of doing it for a small person who couldn't reach the sleeves. And she stood there for a moment after, adjusting the collar with her back still half turned. "The foundation isn't hypothetical," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It's been real for 8 months. I've just been quiet about it." "I know," he said. She turned. "How?" "Because you said you've been developing it, not thinking about developing it. Those are different words." She looked at him for a long moment in the lobby light, the warmer, less performed light of the hotel entrance, away from the ballroom's calculated glow. "I'd like to continue this conversation," she said, "in a context that isn't a charity gala. A context with better coffee and fewer people performing," he said. "Exactly that." He pulled on his coat. "I'm free Thursday evening, after 7. Gracie has a reading club she does at the library on Thursday afternoons, and Mrs. Okafor picks her up, so—" He stopped, aware that he was providing logistical detail she hadn't asked for. "Thursday after 7, Isabella said. She didn't look at a phone or a calendar. "I'll send you an address." "You don't have my contact." She reached into the small clutch she'd been carrying and produced a card. Her card, slim and cream, with just a name and a number, no title, and held it out. "That's mine. Send me a text so I have yours." He took the card. He sent a text from the lobby that said only his name, Liam Parker. And she looked at her phone once, briefly, and put it away. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. She walked out ahead of him. A car was already waiting, her assistant holding the door. And he stood in the hotel entrance and watched the car pull away into the Chicago night, and stood there a few seconds longer than he needed to, just holding the cold air. He had a 6 a.m. call. He had a daughter sleeping with one sock on someone else's couch. He had a coat check card still in his pocket from an evening he'd started trying to leave and ended up staying through to the end. He walked out into the night and pulled his jacket against the November cold and didn't think about the room he'd just left or the people still in it. He thought about what she'd said. The incentive structures are built wrong, and the way she'd said it, with that compressed, almost frustrated conviction of someone who'd been watching the same broken system for years and had finally decided to do something other than wait for it to fix itself. Behind him, in the warm light of the Meridian Grand, Derek Solon and Marcus Webb were still at their table, still bent toward each other in that calculating angle. Neither of them had noticed what they'd actually witnessed tonight. That didn't surprise him. Most people in rooms like that never saw past the surface of a thing to the structure underneath. It was, in the end, their fundamental limitation. They were looking at appearances and calling it analysis. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Okafor to say he was on his way. Thursday came the way significant things tend to, without fanfare, inside an ordinary sequence of ordinary hours. Liam spent most of it at his desk running projected yield models for a client who kept changing the parameters mid-analysis, and by 5:30 his eyes ached and he had 3 competing spreadsheets open and a cold cup of coffee he'd forgotten about at 9 a.m. still sitting at the corner of his desk. He closed the spreadsheets, closed the laptop, and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of an office emptying out around him. The distant percussion of someone's chair rolling back, the elevator chime, the specific silence that settles when the fluorescent lights are still on, but the human activity has drained away. He thought about Thursday evening the way he'd been thinking about it since Tuesday. Not obsessively, not with the particular species of anxiety he associated with things he couldn't control, but with the steady low-grade awareness of something that had changed the ambient conditions of his week without his full permission. He'd gone over their conversation at the gala more times than he'd intended to. Not the surface of it, not the ballroom entrance and the silenced laughter and Derek's color draining, but the parts that had come after, the quieter parts, the conversation at the corner table where the light was lower and the performance requirement had dropped away. The incentive structures are built wrong. He kept returning to that, to the way she'd said it, not as complaint, not as the particular theatrical frustration of someone who wanted to be seen caring about something, but as a plain factual statement from someone who'd been staring at the same broken mechanism long enough to have a plan for it. He got home at 6:15, changed out of his work clothes, and had 45 minutes before he needed to leave. He used 20 of them making Gracie's dinner, pasta with the specific red sauce she'd declared her favorite 2 years ago and had not wavered from since, and ate standing at the counter while she told him, in exhaustive detail, about the book her reading club had discussed that afternoon. "It's about a girl whose parents disappear," Gracie said, twirling pasta with the focused energy of someone who had a lot more to say and needed fuel for it. "And she has to take care of her little brothers. There's 4 of them. That's a lot of brothers. 2 of them are twins. They're the worst ones." She pointed her fork at him for emphasis. "The author clearly has twin brothers." "You think so?" "I know so. You can tell." She ate a mouthful, chewed, swallowed with the efficiency of someone who resented interruptions to her narrative momentum. "Where are you going tonight?" "Meeting, kind of. Kind of a meeting. A meeting that might become something else. I'm not sure yet." Gracie considered this with the evaluative patience she'd inherited from somewhere that was not immediately identifiable. "Is it a date?" He stopped. "No, it's a work conversation." "You changed your shirt twice." He had, in fact, changed his shirt twice, a fact he had believed he'd managed privately while she was in her room. He looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old and possessed of a forensic attention to detail that occasionally made him feel like a suspect. "I changed it once," he said. "I heard the closet open twice. The second time I was getting my jacket. Your jacket was on the hook by the door." There was a silence. "It's a work conversation," he said. "Okay, Daddy?" The tone of her okay carried the complete absence of conviction. She went back to her pasta. Mrs. Okafor arrived at 6:50, bearing a tin of the shortbread cookies she made from a recipe she claimed was her grandmother's, and which Gracie consumed with the focused reverence of a religious practice. Liam kissed the top of Gracie's head, received a brief businesslike pat on the arm in return, her standard farewell when she was already engaged in something more interesting, and left the apartment feeling oddly lighter than the situation probably warranted. The address Isabella had texted him was not a restaurant. It was an office building in the West Loop, modern, glass-fronted, the kind that hadn't existed in that neighborhood a decade ago, and now sat beside renovated warehouses and specialty coffee shops with the comfortable confidence of money that had decided this was where it wanted to be. The lobby directory listed 12 companies. Hartwell Capital occupied the 9th floor. He stood at the building entrance for a moment, recalibrating. Then he went in. The 9th floor was different from what he'd expected. He'd pictured the standard architecture of financial power. Glass partitions, aggressive minimalism, the kind of furniture that communicated we spent money on this deliberately and we'd like you to know it. What he found instead was a space that looked genuinely used, whiteboards covered in handwriting, stacks of bound reports on conference tables, the particular organized disorder of a place where people were actually working rather than performing the idea of work. The lighting was warm. There was a plant near the window that was authentically struggling, listing slightly to one side with the philosophical resignation of something that had been forgotten to water on too many consecutive Fridays. A young woman at the reception desk, early 20s, reading something she put down without embarrassment when he came in, told him Isabella was in the East Conference Room and led him there without ceremony. Isabella was standing at a long table covered in printed documents and a laptop that had 4 browser tabs open, and a coffee cup beside it that was the same level of cold forgotten as the one Liam had left on his desk that morning. She was wearing what appeared to be expensive clothes, in the way of someone who dressed for a day that had lasted longer than it was supposed to and had stopped registering what she was wearing several hours ago, one sleeve pushed up, the other not, her hair less precisely arranged than it had been Tuesday night. "You're on time," she said, looking up. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised. Most people aren't." She gestured at the table. "Sit anywhere. I need 2 more minutes with this." He sat. He looked at the documents nearest to him without reading them, not out of incuriosity, but out of the same instinct that made him wait to be offered information rather than extract it. He looked instead at the wall beside the window, where someone had taped up a large printed map of Chicago's neighborhoods, with hand-drawn annotations, numbers, arrows, a color-coding system he couldn't decode from here. "That's the targeting framework," she said, without looking up from her laptop. "For the foundation. If you're looking at the map..." "I was being polite." "You were being curious and being polite about it." She closed the laptop. "Which is fine. Look at it." He got up and looked at the map. It was more complex than it had appeared from across the room. The color coding corresponded to a legend at the bottom, cross-referencing employment density, median household income, proximity to public transit, school quality metrics, access to banking infrastructure. It was the kind of map that took months to build correctly. The annotations were in 2 different handwritings. Hers, he guessed, was the smaller, compressed script in blue, and someone else had added notes in red that had the shorthand quality of someone who'd been in a lot of meetings with her and had learned the vocabulary. "Who's the red pen?" he asked. "My research director, Alicia. She's been with me 4 years. Isabella came around the table and stood beside him looking at the map. "She's the one who found your Maplewood work, actually. She flagged it." "She found it how?" "She monitors restructuring outcomes in specific zip codes. Maplewood's employment retention numbers showed up in a quarterly data pull. She traced the methodology back to the consultant." A pause. "It took her a while. You were careful about the trail." "It wasn't my outcome to claim." "You keep saying things like that," she said, and there was an edge in it, but not frustration with him, but with something else, some larger context. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "It confuses me," she said honestly. "I've spent 6 years in rooms full of people who would have turned that restructuring into a case study, a speaking engagement, and 3 LinkedIn posts before the ink was dry on the final agreement. And you just..." She made a small gesture that meant nothing. "So either you're the most genuinely modest person I've ever met, or you have a reason for staying quiet that I haven't figured out yet." He looked at the map. "Both," he said. She waited. "The modesty part is real," he said. "I don't like the performance of having done things. It costs energy I'd rather spend doing the next thing." He paused. "The reason for staying quiet is that I'm not in a position to absorb the complications that come with visibility. I have a daughter and a job that pays the mortgage, and a consulting practice that's still small enough that one bad professional relationship could damage it. Being quiet is not humility, it's risk management." She was looking at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, that evaluative stillness, the look of someone running a calculation. "What would change that calculation?" she said. "A different risk profile. More security. More foundation," he said. "Security is the word people use when they mean they want to stop being afraid. Foundation is different. It's what you build on. You can be afraid and still build." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the table and picked up her coffee cup, looked into it, and set it back down with the expression of someone who'd hoped for something other than cold coffee and was not surprised to have received it anyway. "I'm going to be direct," she said. "You've been direct since the lobby of the Meridian Grand. More direct." She turned to face him fully. "I've been looking for someone to co-lead the operational design of the foundation. Not the investment side. I have that. The design of the support infrastructure, the educational components, the community interface, the methodology for how we evaluate whether what we're doing is actually working, as opposed to just feeling like it's working. That's a different skill set." He stood very still. "I'm not offering you the position right now," she said, and her voice was careful in a way that acknowledged she was aware of the weight of what she was placing on the table. "I'm telling you that's what I've been looking for. And then I'm going to tell you that the work you've been doing, the library sessions, the website, Maplewood, is a closer match to that skill set than anything I've found in 18 months of looking." She picked up a document from the table and held it, not handing it to him yet. I'd want to see how you think through a specific design problem. A working session, properly compensated. No obligation either direction. He was quiet. Say what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking that I don't know you, he said. I met you 4 days ago. Yes. And that this, he gestured at the room, the map, the documents, is a significant thing to be on the receiving end of from someone I met 4 days ago. Yes. And I'm thinking that the reason you're in this office at 7:30 on a Thursday, instead of having this conversation somewhere with better lighting and a wine list, is that you wanted me to see the actual work, not a presentation of it. She held his gaze. Yes. Why? Because I needed to know whether you'd respond to the work or to the opportunity, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. He looked at the map on the wall. He thought about the library on the northwest side on Saturday mornings, and the family on his street, and the years of kitchen table work after Gracie fell asleep, and the specific quiet satisfaction of a thing done well in the dark, with no one watching. All right, he said. All right, you'll think about it, or, all right, I'll do the working session, he said. Send me the design problem. Something in her shoulders moved, not quite relief, but the release of a tension he hadn't been fully aware she was carrying. She nodded once, the brisk, decisive nod he recognized from the gala. I'll have Alicia send it by end of week. Good. A pause. Then she said, There's a Thai place 2 blocks from here that's still open. I haven't eaten since noon. Neither have I, he said. She picked up her jacket from the back of a chair. Then we're solving 2 problems at once. The Thai place was small and bright and slightly too warm in the way of restaurants that had been packed all evening and hadn't fully recovered, and they took a corner table and ordered quickly because they were both actually hungry rather than performing the social ritual of deciding what to eat. She got the green curry. He got the basil noodles. She stole 2 of his noodles with her fork without asking, and he didn't say anything because he'd already taken one of her spring rolls, and they both registered this and didn't acknowledge it. It was a comfortable dynamic. That was the thing that surprised him most about her. Not her intelligence or her directness or the quality of her thinking, all of which he'd expected from what he'd known of her reputation. What surprised him was how comfortable the space between them had become in 4 days, without his noticing it happen. Tell me about the part that scares you, she said, around the midpoint of the meal. It had the quality of something she'd been holding since the office. About the working session? About any of it, the consulting practice, leaving Aurora, what you're actually afraid of. He considered not answering that. He considered the edited version. He gave her the real one. That I miscalculate the timing, he said. I have a window. Gracie is 8. There's a 10-year period starting now where the decisions I make about how I spend my professional energy have direct consequences for her stability. Her school, our apartment, whether there's money for the things she needs, and occasionally the things she just wants. I'm not afraid of risk. I take calculated risks constantly. What I'm afraid of is taking the wrong one at the wrong moment and having it be her who pays for it. She was quiet for a moment, not the polite quiet of someone waiting for a pause to speak, the actual quiet of someone absorbing what they'd just heard. She's the variable you protect above all others, she said. She's not a variable, he said with a gentleness that had a limit in it. She's my kid. I know, I said it wrong. She didn't rush past it. I meant that she's the thing the whole calculation is built around. Yes. Then I want you to know... She stopped, chose her words with the care of someone who understood their weight. That anything I propose professionally will be structured with that reality factored in. I'm not looking for someone to bet their family's stability on my timeline. That's not what this is. He looked at her across the small table, in the too warm light of the restaurant, with the ambient noise of other people's conversations around them, and the smell of curry and garlic, and the specific ordinary warmth of a place that was just a place, no performance required. Why are you telling me that? He said. Because it needed to be said. Most people don't bother. Most people, she said carefully, aren't asking you for something that matters. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at his food. Something had shifted in the temperature of the room, though the room itself was unchanged. He was aware of it the way you're aware of things you don't intend to act on but can't stop noticing. He ate. She ate. They talked about the foundation design problem she was planning to send him, the specific challenge of building evaluation frameworks that captured human outcomes rather than just financial metrics. And the conversation had the quality of two people thinking out loud together, finishing each other's logical threads, pushing back on the weak points without softening them, because neither of them had the patience for the softened version. It was the best conversation he'd had in longer than he could precisely identify. They were outside the restaurant, on the sidewalk in the November cold, when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Mrs. Okafor. And something in his chest dropped 2 inches the way it always did when his neighbor called during an evening out. The irrational, immediate parental alarm that never entirely went away regardless of how many times it had been a non-emergency. He answered, "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She's fine," Mrs. Okafor said quickly. "She's asleep. She woke up about 20 minutes ago asking for you, and she was a little upset, and I got her settled back down, but I thought you should know. I'll be home in 20 minutes. "There's no rush, Liam. She's 20 minutes, he said. He hung up and looked at Isabella. "I have to go." "Of course." No hesitation, no negotiation. "Is she all right?" "She's fine. He stopped. "She doesn't love when I'm out late. She doesn't say that, but she doesn't love it." Isabella was looking at him with an expression that had something in it he didn't examine. "Not right now." "Go," she said. He raised his hand for a cab, which appeared with the convenient promptness that sometimes graces moments when you genuinely need it. He had 1 foot off the curb when she said his name. He turned. "The design problem," she said. "When Alicia sends it, there's a section on single-parent household financial stability that I've been struggling with. The framework I have feels like it was built by someone who knows the data without knowing the life." She paused. "I think you know the life." He stood on the edge of the curb, the cab idling, the November wind finding the gap between his jacket collar and his neck, and he looked at this woman who had walked through a door 4 days ago and rearranged something in his life he hadn't expected to have rearranged. "I'll read it carefully," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm sending it to you." He got in the cab. He didn't look back because looking back was a habit he'd worked for years to break, and some habits held even when you wanted to set them down. He was home in 18 minutes. Gracie was asleep on her side with the blanket pulled up and 1 sock on, always 1 sock, and he sat on the edge of her bed for a moment in the dark and watched her breathe the way he had when she was 6 months old, and he was terrified and alone and had no idea what he was doing. He knew slightly more now, about some things. He pulled her blanket up an inch, turned off the hall light, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. Not to work, just to sit in the familiar geometry of the place where he did his thinking. He thought about Isabella saying, "The incentive structures are built wrong." He thought about the map on the wall and the 2 handwritings. He thought about Gracie asking him if it was a date, with that devastating 8-year-old absence of pretense. He closed the laptop. He'd read the design problem when it came. What he didn't think about, not yet, not that night, was what had been happening across the city in the hours since the gala, in conversations he wasn't party to, between people who had noticed what happened Tuesday night and had spent the days since working out what to do about it. He didn't think about Derek Solin's particular expression at that table, or the angle of Marcus Webb's head, or the specific quality of a calculation being made by men who believed that proximity to power was a resource to be harvested. He wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about a woman who had looked at a map on a wall and built a framework for the neighborhoods that the rest of the room had never learned to see. 3 days later, his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. The voice on the other end was male, polished, with the specific warmth of someone who'd been trained to sound warmer than they were. "Mr. Parker, my name is Christopher Vale. I'm a strategic advisor to several senior figures at Aurora Ventures, and I believe we have something worth discussing, something that could be mutually beneficial. For you, and for the people I represent." A pause, precisely timed. "This is regarding your connection to Isabella Hartwell." Liam stood in his kitchen and said nothing. "I understand you've developed something of a relationship with Ms. Hartwell," Vale continued, "which is a remarkable opportunity given your position. There are people who would value, very generously, a more direct line of communication with her thinking, her investment priorities, her foundation plans, specifically. Another pause. You're a smart man, Mr. Parker. You understand how these things work. Liam looked at the window. The November sky outside was the same bruised gray-purple it had been the night of the gala, and the city beneath it was going about its business with the indifference cities have toward individual human moments. I understand how you think they work, Liam said. A brief silence on the other end, the first unscripted beat. I'm sorry? I'm going to hang up now, Liam said. I'd suggest you don't call again. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding the phone, while Gracie's voice drifted from the other room. She was reading aloud to herself, the way she did when she was particularly engaged with a book, the running murmur of someone who wanted to hear the words in addition to seeing them. He looked at his phone. He thought about what the call meant, not its surface, but its structure. Someone had been watching. Someone had connected his name to Isabella's fast enough to make a move within days of the gala. That was the kind of speed that required preparation. It meant the call was not opportunistic. It meant someone had been ready for exactly this scenario, which meant they'd been monitoring Isabella's movements, her associations, her contacts, long enough to have a protocol in place. That was not Derek Solon acting alone. That was something more organized than a senior manager with a grudge. He pulled up his contacts and typed a text to Isabella. He kept it plain. Something happened. I think you need to know about. Not urgent, but not nothing. When you have a minute. Her response came 11 minutes later, which told him she read it as more than nothing. Tomorrow morning, my office. 8? He typed back, I'll be there. He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the kitchen and listened to his daughter read to herself in the next room. The unself-conscious, unperformed sound of a person engaged with something she loved, and felt the specific, heavy clarity of a situation coming into focus. Someone had decided that his connection to Isabella Hartwell was useful to them, and they had made the fundamental error of believing he was the kind of man who could be used. He was at her office at 7:58. The same young woman from Thursday evening was at the reception desk, this time with a coffee in hand and the slightly startled expression of someone who hadn't expected anyone to arrive before 8 on a Friday. She called back, listened, nodded, and told him to go straight through. Isabella was already at the conference table. She had the map on the wall and a second one beside it. Printed overnight, it looked like, the ink slightly darker at the edges the way fresh prints came out. And she had a legal pad in front of her with handwriting on it that started organized at the top and grew more compressed as it went down the page, the physical record of someone who'd been thinking faster than they could write. There was a coffee in front of her and another one across the table, which told him she'd expected him before the conversation started. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Tell me, she said. He told her, exactly as it happened, the unrecognized number, the scripted warmth in Vale's voice, the specific language used, mutually beneficial, generous, direct line of communication. He didn't editorialize. He gave her the words as close to verbatim as his memory held them and let her draw her own conclusions. She listened without interrupting, which was a discipline. He could see her wanting to speak twice during the recounting and holding it back both times. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the legal pad. Christopher Vale, she said. You know him? I know who he is. She turned the legal pad over. He's not a strategic advisor in any formal sense. He's a facilitator. He moves between investment groups, not as a fiduciary, not with any formal accountability structure, and he facilitates the kind of communication that people want deniable channels for. Who does he work for? On any given day, several people. But the language you're describing, foundation plan specifically, that narrows it. She stood up and walked to the new map, and he noticed she was barefoot. She'd taken her shoes off under the conference table and hadn't put them back on, and it was such an ordinary human detail in the middle of everything that it briefly arrested his attention. There are 3 investor groups who've been trying to get advance information on the foundation structure for the past 4 months. 2 of them want to position early for reputational advantage. They want to be seen as aligned with it before it launches, which means they need to know the direction before it becomes public. The third... She stopped. The third is different, he said. The third wants it to fail. She said it flatly. Or at minimum, wants to shape it in ways that protect their existing portfolio. Several of my foundation targets are areas where one particular investment group has significant holdings in financial products that the foundation would directly compete with. Payday lending infrastructure, predatory short-term credit instruments. She turned from the map. If I build what I'm building, I put a dent in their business model. Not a fatal one, but meaningful. He absorbed this. And they think that pressuring a contact of yours is, they think leverage works, she said, because it usually does. They find someone proximate to the target, someone with vulnerability, financial vulnerability, professional vulnerability, and they apply pressure. The person either cooperates or they become a liability the target has to manage, which creates distance and buys time. She sat back down. It's a functional strategy. It works on most people. It didn't work on me. No. She looked at him. You called me instead. He held her gaze. Was there any version of this where you thought I might not? A pause that was honest rather than performed. I didn't know you a week ago, she said. I made a judgment at the door of a ballroom based on limited information. Good judgment is still a probability, not a guarantee. And now? Now I'm recalibrating the probability upward, she said, and there was something wry in it, some quiet humor at the edge that she let show for a moment before the composure settled back. He looked at his coffee. You need to know something else, he said. Go ahead. The call didn't come from outside the firm. The way Vail positioned it, people I represent, senior figures at Aurora Ventures. He named the firm. He didn't need to do that unless he was establishing that the pressure had institutional backing. She was very still. Someone at Aurora is involved, he said. That's a short list of people with the standing to connect with someone like Vail. Vance, she said. I don't know. Or someone reporting to Vance. She pressed her fingertips to her forehead for a moment. A brief private gesture, the kind that slips out when the professional composure is momentarily outpaced by the human weight of a thing. Robert Vance is on the Foundation's preliminary advisory list. I put him there 3 months ago because Aurora has community-facing fund relationships that would be useful infrastructure partners. If he's been using that position to... She stopped, breathed. That's a betrayal of something I was careful about. Yeah, Liam said. She looked at him. Does this change your calculation? About the working session, about any of it? He looked at the map on the wall, the two-handwriting map, the color-coded framework, the months of work that lived in the annotations and arrows and the small compressed blue script that was hers. No, he said. Liam, it doesn't change my calculation. He said it without drama, without the particular firmness of someone trying to sound certain. Just plainly, the way he stated practical facts about himself. I told you the reason I stay quiet is risk management. This is a new risk, and I'm managing it the same way I manage every other one, by being honest about what I know and who I know it with. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the legal pad. I'm going to need to move faster than I planned, she said. If they're already applying pressure to my contacts, the timeline I had is no longer safe. The longer the Foundation's design stays in private development, the more room there is for this kind of interference. You want to accelerate the launch. I want to accelerate something. I haven't decided what. She pulled the legal pad toward her and uncapped a pen. I have a board presentation scheduled in 3 weeks. 4 major investors who've committed contingently. They want a clearer structural overview before they confirm. If I can walk into that presentation with the operational design further along than it currently is, then you reduce the window for interference, he said. Yes. He looked at the map. He thought about the design problem Alicia had emailed him 2 days ago. The section on single-parent household financial stability that Isabella had mentioned on the sidewalk outside the Thai restaurant. He'd read it twice. He'd been thinking about it since. I have notes on the framework you sent, he said. The evaluation methodology section. She looked up. I've been thinking about it since Alicia sent it. I was going to wait until the formal working session, but... He shrugged. You have 3 weeks. We should probably not wait. Something in her expression shifted. That small private adjustment he'd seen twice before. The one that happened when something landed differently than she'd prepared for. You've already been working on it. I had thoughts. I wrote them down. Without being asked. You gave me a problem, he said simply. I think about problems. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Liam, I need to tell you something about what I was doing before the board presentation. He waited. I was going to approach you formally next month, she said. After the working session, after I had a cleaner picture. I had a sequence planned out. I had a whole careful process for not pressuring you, for making sure you had time and space to evaluate this without feeling like the opportunity was contingent on a timeline that wasn't yours. She paused. The call you got last night has shortened that sequence. I can't do the careful version now. And I need you to know that I know that, and I'm sorry for it because you deserve the careful version. He looked at her. It was an unusual thing to hear from someone in her position. Not an apology for doing something wrong, but for being unable to do something right. He'd spent years in professional environments where apologies were deployed strategically, where I'm sorry was a conversational move rather than a feeling. This was not that. It's all right, he said. It's not, actually. But thank you. What do you need right now? He said. Specifically, today. She looked at the legal pad. I need to know whether the interference came from within the advisory structure so I can contain it before the board presentation. And I need the operational design to be at a point where it can withstand scrutiny from 4 investors who will be looking for any reason to wait. Those are 2 different problems. Yes. Which one do you want me on? She met his eyes. The design. I have a lawyer who handles the other kind of problem. You have skills I don't have covered. He nodded once. Then let's work. They spent 4 hours at that conference table. He'd brought his laptop. She had hers. Alicia came in at 9:30, registered his presence without visible surprise, the professional composure of someone who worked for Isabella Hartwell and had learned to absorb the unexpected without editorial, and contributed 2 hours of her own work to the session before a conflicting meeting pulled her out. The coffee got refreshed twice. Someone left sandwiches outside the conference room door at noon without being asked, which told him this was a place that had done marathon work sessions before. The evaluation framework problem was real, and it was specific, and he understood within the first 20 minutes why Isabella had been struggling with it. The standard impact investing metrics she'd been working from were built on assumptions about stability that didn't hold for the population she was designing for. A working single parent's financial trajectory wasn't linear. It moved in the non-linear pattern of everything going well until one thing went wrong, and the one thing could be a medical bill or a car repair or a school supply expense or a missed shift, and the evaluation methodology needed to account for the fact that progress wasn't a steady upward slope, but a series of recoveries. The metric you're using for financial improvement is month-over-month net change, he said. That's measuring the wrong thing. What should I be measuring? Recovery velocity, he said. How fast someone gets back to their baseline after a disruption. That's the actual indicator of whether the support structure is working, not whether the line goes up, whether it stabilizes after it dips. She looked at the screen where she'd been building the methodology table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the compressed energy of someone whose thinking had just taken a turn, if we track recovery velocity, we can also identify the specific disruption types that most commonly interrupt stability, which means we can design preemptive support structures instead of just responsive ones. Right. Which changes the whole intake framework, she said, already typing. The intake questions need to map the disruption risk profile, not just the current financial state. The disruption history, he said. What's happened before predicts what's vulnerable. Someone who's had 3 car-related financial crises in 2 years has a transportation vulnerability, not a general financial instability. Those are solved differently. She stopped typing. She looked at him. How long have you been thinking about this? Since Alicia sent the framework. You developed this in 2 days. I've been living adjacent to this problem for 8 years, he said. I've been watching it happen on my block, in my daughter's school, in my neighbor's family. I have a lot of raw material. She looked at him for a long moment. Not the evaluating look, something more still than that. You said once that you know the life, she said. You said that. Outside the restaurant. You said you'd read it carefully. I did. She turned back to the screen, and he could see from the movement of her shoulders that she was doing the thing he recognized, managing something internal, pressing it down below the surface of the work because the work needed both of them present and the other thing needed to wait. He recognized it because he did it too, and had for years, and he understood the discipline it required. They kept working. At 1:15 her phone rang. She looked at the screen, and something in her face went flat in a particular way. The professional flatness of someone about to have a conversation they'd already had once in their head. She stood and took it in the hallway. He could hear the murmur of her voice, but not the words. He used the time to cross-reference two sections of the framework that had a structural inconsistency he hadn't flagged yet. The intake criteria overlapped with the eligibility criteria in a way that would create a double counting problem in the impact assessment. He marked it with a comment in the shared document. She came back in after 8 minutes. She sat down and didn't immediately speak. That was Robert Vance, she said. He waited. He called to tell me that he'd become aware of some concerns among the Aurora Investment Group regarding the foundation's strategic direction, and that he wanted to discuss them before the board presentation in a private setting to avoid any— She paused with a precision that was itself a kind of anger. Misalignment in expectations. He used those words, word for word. What are you going to do? She looked at the framework on the screen. I'm going to meet with him, she said, because I want to hear exactly what he says in his own voice, so there is no ambiguity about what happened. She paused. And I'm going to bring my lawyer. And the board presentation stays on schedule. Her jaw had a particular set to it, not rigid, just decided. The look of someone who has moved past the point where there were multiple options and is now operating in the clean clarity of having only one. We finished this framework I presented in 3 weeks. What they've been doing in the background doesn't change what this is or whether it's worth building. He looked at the document on the screen. At the methodology they'd spent 4 hours constructing, the recovery velocity metrics, the disruption risk profiling, the preemptive support structures, all of it built from the raw material of years of lived experience and careful observation and the library sessions on Saturday mornings that nobody had ever seen as a credential. There's a comment in section 4, he said, double counting issue and the eligibility overlap. You'll want to look at it. She pulled up the document, found the comment, read it. Her mouth did the almost smile. You found this while I was on the phone. I had 8 minutes. She looked at the screen. You're very strange, Liam Parker. You said that before. It keeps being true. He submitted his resignation to Aurora Ventures that afternoon. Not impulsively. He'd been calculating it for 2 years, the same way he calculated everything, running the numbers forward and backward, adjusting for Gracie's needs, adjusting for the consulting practice's growth trajectory, adjusting for risk. The calculation had been close for 6 months. Christopher Vale's phone call had simply resolved the final variable. He drafted the letter at his desk at Aurora with the particular focus of someone who had been waiting to do something for long enough that the doing of it came with a specific physical relief. Like setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten what it felt like to carry it. He gave the standard 2 weeks. He thanked Robert Vance by name for the professional opportunities without any inflection that would make a lawyer nervous. He sent it to HR at 4:45. At 4:46, he sent a text to Isabella. Letters in. Her response came in under a minute. How do you feel? He thought about that for a moment, sitting at the desk where he'd spent 3 years running analyses for a firm that had never once asked him a question in that register. Lighter, he typed back. Mostly. He could almost see her smile at that. The real one, the uneven one that started in her eyes. He packed his desk into a single box. It fit more easily than he expected, which told him something about how much of himself he'd actually invested in this particular space. He carried the box to the elevator. He pressed the lobby button. He thought about Gracie saying mostly in the hallway, examining him from every angle. He thought about what she'd say when he told her. She'd have questions, practical questions about what came next, because she was his daughter and she thought that way, had absorbed his habit of thinking through consequences without being taught it. She'd ask if they were going to be okay. He'd tell her yes, and mean it, and she'd look at him the way she did when she was assessing whether to take his word for something or demand more evidence. And then she'd probably tell him about whatever chapter she'd gotten to in her book, and that would be that. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. He walked out into the November afternoon, colder now, the city in its long exhale toward winter, and stood on the sidewalk with his single box and felt the specific vertigo of a thing actually changed rather than merely contemplated. He had a daughter. He had a consulting practice that was about to become his primary income. He had a working session with a woman who'd been building something in the dark for 8 months and had been looking for someone who understood why you built things in the dark. The risks were real. He'd run the numbers and they were manageable, not comfortable, and there was a difference. He wasn't afraid of manageable. He was afraid of the wrong manageable, the kind that looked like safety and was actually just a smaller cage. He'd been in that cage for 3 years at Aurora, and the thing about a cage that fits is that you don't always feel the bars until you move. He was moving. He started walking toward the train station, his box under one arm, his coat inadequate against the wind in the specific way of a coat bought for the previous winter, and he thought about the board presentation in 3 weeks, and the framework they'd built, and the disruption risk profiling and the recovery velocity metrics that would need 2 more working sessions to finalize. He thought about Isabella's voice on the phone. Not her professional voice, but the other one. The one that came out when she'd stopped editing. The one that had said, "I think you know the life," with a specific, quiet certainty. He thought about her barefoot at the conference table with the compressed handwriting on the legal pad. He didn't think about what Derek Solon would say on Monday when the news reached him, or the expression on Vance's face when he figured out what Liam had and hadn't done with Christopher Vale's call. He didn't think about the people in the ballroom who'd laughed, and where they were now in their careers, and whether they were happy. He thought about Gracie's book about the girl with 4 brothers, 2 of them twins, and how the author clearly had twin brothers, and how you could tell. He caught the train. He got a seat. He put the box on his lap and looked out the window at the city passing at train speed, the flat rooftops, the water towers, the particular visual grammar of a Midwest city that had built itself one neighborhood at a time and carried all of them simultaneously. His phone buzzed. Not Isabella this time. A number he didn't recognize, different from Vale's, but the same area code. He looked at it for a long moment while the train moved. Then he sent it to voicemail and watched the city go by. Whatever they were trying hadn't worked the first time. It wouldn't work better with repetition. That was the thing about people who operated on the assumption that everyone had a price. They kept going because the strategy worked often enough to remain viable. What they couldn't account for was the person who genuinely didn't have the price they were offering. Not because the price wasn't real money, wasn't a real opportunity, wasn't something that would have made his life materially easier in ways he could measure, but because what they were asking him to trade for it wasn't something he knew how to rebuild once it was gone. His integrity wasn't an asset he decided to protect. It was the structure everything else was built on. Take it out and nothing else held. He had a daughter watching how he handled hard choices. He had a woman who trusted him with something she hadn't told anyone in 8 months. He had exactly one thing to do with Christopher Vale's call, and he'd already done it. The train slid into his stop. He got off, carried his box up the stairs, walked the 3 blocks to his building in the cold that was deepening toward real winter now. He unlocked the front door and climbed to the 3rd floor and set the box down in the hallway and stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of an afternoon apartment before anyone small and fierce had come home from school. He went to the kitchen. He made coffee. He sat at the table where he did his thinking and opened his laptop to the shared document, and he worked on the framework for an hour in the late afternoon quiet before he heard the key in the lock and the specific sequence of sounds that was Gracie arriving. The drop bag, the kicked-off shoes, the percussion of a person who moved through space with complete physical confidence. "Daddy, why is there a box in the hallway?" "I brought some things home from work." A pause. He could hear her processing this from the hallway, running her internal calculation. Then her footsteps, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her coat, with her hair half out of its morning braid. "Did you quit?" she said. He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She looked at him with that clear, assessing look. "Is that good or bad?" "It's good," he said. It's the right kind of scary. She chewed on that for a moment. Then she came into the kitchen, climbed onto the chair across from him the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to climb, and looked at the laptop screen. "Is that the foundation thing?" she said. He stared at her. "How do you know about the foundation?" "Mrs. Okafor told me a lady called for you, and you've been working on that." She pointed at the screen. "Every night this week. You can't read the screen from there." "I can see there's a map," she said simply. He looked at his daughter. He thought about Isabella looking at the map on her office wall, and he thought about Gracie looking at the map on his screen, and he thought about the two of them and the specific, unfamiliar way that thought sat in him. Not uncomfortable, not presumptuous, just present, like a thing that had been placed carefully in a corner of his awareness and was waiting. "Tell me about the girl with the brothers," he said. "The book." Gracie settled into the chair and began, with the authority of someone who had a lot of ground to cover and saw no reason to rush. Outside, Chicago moved into its evening, the streetlights coming on, the traffic thickening, the lake somewhere beyond everything doing what it had always done, which was to be enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to any individual human story, while somehow, from the right angle, making every individual human story feel like it had the space it needed. The meeting with Robert Vance happened on a Wednesday, 9 days before the board presentation. Isabella had chosen the location herself, a small conference room at her lawyer's office in the Loop, neutral ground, nothing that would give Vance the comfort of familiar territory or the advantage of a home court. Liam wasn't there for the meeting. He wasn't supposed to be. But Isabella had called him at 9 that morning, 20 minutes before she walked in, and he'd heard in her voice the specific quality of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was calling not for advice but for the particular grounding that comes from hearing a steady voice before you go into something difficult. "Tell me about Gracie," she said, when he answered. He understood immediately. "She's decided the twins in her book are the villains," he said. "She made a formal case for this at dinner last night, evidence-based. She used the word corroborating. She's 8. She reads a lot." A pause. He heard her breathe. "Okay," she said. "You're ready," he said. "I know, I just—" She stopped. "I'll call you after." "I'll be here." She went in. He waited. He was at the kitchen table with the framework document open, working on the final section of the operational design that needed to be cleaned before the board presentation, and he worked with the focused but slightly distracted quality of someone who had two things running simultaneously in their head, the spreadsheet in front of him and the room he wasn't in. She called it 11:47. "How bad?" he said instead of hello. "Comprehensive," she said. Her voice was even, with the flatness of someone who had finished being surprised and was now in the colder, more useful register of someone cataloging damage. He's been sharing preliminary foundation documents with 2 investor groups for 6 weeks, framing it as due diligence on a potential partnership, which gave him a plausible cover for why he had the information. What he was actually doing was giving them enough structural detail to build a counter-positioning strategy. How did he get the documents? Advisory committee access. I trusted him with working drafts because I trusted his institutional relationships. A pause. That was an error in judgment on my part. It was an error in information, he said. You didn't know what he was. I should have, Isabella. He said her name in a way that stopped the sentence. You trusted someone who had given you every professional reason to trust them. That's not bad judgment. That's how trust works. The failure was his. Silence. Then, my lawyer has the documentation. She's moving on it today. Another pause, shorter. Vance cried. Actually cried? Actual tears, a full minute of them. He said he was trying to protect the foundation from itself, that he was concerned my timeline was too aggressive, and that the investor groups he'd been talking to were going to be essential partners eventually anyway, so he was just... She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Accelerating the relationship-building process. What did you say? I asked him to leave. My lawyer handled the rest. Liam was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? I'm angry, she said. Not the hot kind. The cold kind. The cold kind is useful. I know, that's why I'm holding on to it. He could hear her moving that. Footsteps, a door, the acoustic shift of going from inside to outside. He's off the advisory committee. His firm's relationship with Hartwell Capital is terminated as of today. My lawyer is exploring whether the document sharing constitutes a breach we can pursue formally. Does it change the presentation? No. The word was immediate and clean. It changes nothing about the presentation. If anything, it tells me the work is worth protecting because people only interfere with things that threaten something real. She said it with the quiet force of someone who'd arrived at this conclusion through the cold anger and come out the other side of it with something usable. Can you meet tomorrow? There are 2 sections of the framework I want to walk through before I prep the investor materials. 10 o'clock, he said. 10 o'clock. He put the phone down on the table. He sat for a moment in the kitchen in the November light that came through the window at a low, pale angle this time of year, the light of a season that was winding down. He thought about Robert Vance crying in a conference room. He thought about the specific variety of person who betrays trust and then, when caught, constructs a narrative in which the betrayal was actually a form of care. I was protecting you from yourself. He'd encountered that variety before, in smaller ways, in smaller rooms. The scale changed. The mechanism didn't. He turned back to the framework document. He had 4 hours before Gracie came home. He used them. The board presentation was on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Aurora Ventures Gala, in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building in the financial district with windows that looked out over the lake in the way that expensive conference rooms always managed, as if the view were included in the fees. Liam was not presenting. That was Isabella's territory and hers alone, and he had no interest in standing in any part of it. He was in the room because she'd asked him to be, not on the investor side of the table, not as a Hartwell Capital representative, but in the chair along the east wall that the room used for overflow seating, with his laptop and his notes available if she needed to pull a specific data point mid-presentation. There were 4 investors around the table. He'd done his homework on all of them in the 2 weeks prior. Not deep dives, just enough to understand what each of them was likely to scrutinize. 2 of them had impact investing backgrounds and would focus on the measurement methodology. One was a generalist who cared primarily about governance structures. The 4th was a woman named Patricia Henshaw, who had made 3 separate fortunes by asking questions that everyone else had decided were already answered, and who was, in Liam's estimation from what he'd read, the most important person in the room. Isabella walked in at 2:58 with Alicia and her lawyer, set her materials down without ceremony, and looked at the room the way she looked at every room. That quick lateral read, the same thing he did, that habit of understanding the system before engaging it. She caught his eye for half a second. That was all. Then she turned to the table and began. He watched her work. He'd seen her think out loud, had spent hours at conference tables watching her mind move, but he hadn't seen her do this. The full formal version, the one where she was making a case to people with the authority to say no. She was different in this register. Not less herself, but compressed. The warmth and the wry humor and the rotation of wine glasses set aside, replaced by a precision and a density of argument that had the quality of something load-bearing. Every statement supported the next one. Every data point was the foundation for the claim that followed. She got to the evaluation framework 35 minutes in, and he watched Patricia Henshaw sit forward in her chair. The recovery velocity metric, Henshaw said, cutting into the presentation with the comfortable authority of someone who'd been doing this for 40 years and had stopped apologizing for interrupting. That's not standard impact methodology. No, Isabella said. It's not. Where did it come from? It came from thinking about what we're actually trying to measure, Isabella said. Standard impact metrics track improvement. This tracks resilience, which is the difference between a support structure that works when everything goes right and one that works when something goes wrong. For the population we're serving, something going wrong is not an exceptional event. It's a regular feature of the financial landscape. Henshaw looked at the framework page for a moment. Who designed this section? A pause. The operational design was a collaborative process, Isabella said. My research director contributed significantly, and I had a consulting partner who has direct experience with the population we're targeting. I'd like to speak to that partner, Henshaw said. Liam looked up from his laptop. Isabella said, without turning around, "He's in the room." Henshaw looked at the east wall. 3 of the other investors turned to look. Liam sat in his overflow chair with his laptop on his knees, and his notes open, and felt the specific mild discomfort of a man who had deliberately positioned himself outside the performance and been pulled into it anyway. He closed the laptop. He met Henshaw's gaze. "The recovery velocity concept," Henshaw said, addressing him directly with the no-preamble efficiency of someone whose time was genuinely limited. "Walk me through the thinking." He walked her through it. Not from his notes, from the actual thinking, the way he'd been doing it since before it had a name. Since the family on his street with the predatory loan paperwork, since the library sessions on Saturday mornings, since the 8 years of doing the math on a single income, and a daughter and a car that was always slightly breaking down, and understanding viscerally that financial instability for working families was not a straight-line problem and couldn't be measured with straight-line tools. He talked for 6 minutes. He didn't perform it. He just explained it the way he explained everything, plainly, with the specifics that made it real rather than theoretical. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Henshaw looked at Isabella. "Keep him," she said. Isabella said, "That's the plan." All 4 investors confirmed their commitments before the end of the meeting. Not conditionally, not with the usual suite of further due diligence caveats that investor confirmations typically came wrapped in. 2 of them used language that suggested they'd been looking for exactly this kind of structural rigor for longer than the meeting had lasted. Henshaw, walking out, stopped at the east wall and looked at Liam with the evaluative clarity of someone who'd seen a lot of people in a lot of rooms and had stopped being polite about her assessments. "How long have you been doing this work?" she said. 8 years, informally. 2 years with any kind of structure. Why informal? Because I had a daughter to feed and a mortgage to pay, and the informal version didn't require me to bet those things on a timeline. She looked at him. "And now?" "Now I have a different risk profile," he said. She nodded once, the nod of someone who understood risk profiles and respected people who calculated them honestly. Then she left. Alicia was packing up the materials. The other investors had filed out with the assistants and the follow-up scheduling discussions. The room emptied with the efficient speed of people who had other rooms to be in. Isabella and Liam were left at opposite ends of the now emptied table. She was still standing. She'd been on her feet for the entire 90-minute presentation. He watched the slight adjustment in her posture, the release of the load-bearing precision, the return of the person who existed when the performance requirement dropped away. She looked tired. Not the bad kind. The specific, earned tiredness of someone who has done a hard thing and done it well. "That went," he started. "Don't say well," she said. "It makes me suspicious." "It went exactly as the data suggested it would if the framework was sound," he said. She looked at him across the empty table. "That's the nerdiest way anyone has ever said well." "I contain multitudes." She laughed. The real one, the uneven one, the one that started in her eyes. She sat down in the nearest chair, and the formality of the last 2 hours came off her like a coat she'd finally been allowed to remove. She put her elbows on the table and pressed her fingertips briefly to her closed eyes. He moved to sit across from her, leaving one chair between them as a kind of neutral zone, the habitual spacing of 2 people who had been getting incrementally less careful about their proximity and were managing it so far by not naming it. "Patricia Henshaw asked to speak to you specifically," she said. "I noticed." "She doesn't do that. In 15 years of watching her work, I have never seen her asked to speak to the person in the overflow chair." "I was wearing a better suit than last time," he said. Isabella looked at him. "Was that a joke?" "Minor one." "You've been doing that more lately." "The jokes? She made a small gesture. "The showing up in ways I don't expect." He looked at the table. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. The word was immediate and had the quality of something that had been waiting to be said, that had been held carefully in place for weeks, and was tired of being held. "It's the opposite of a problem. That's what's making it complicated." The room was very quiet. 22 floors below, the city went about its business with complete indifference to what was happening in this particular glass-walled room at 3:40 in the afternoon. The lake through the windows was the dark metallic gray of late November, and it was enormous and still. He looked at her. Complicated, he said. I don't... She stopped. Tried a different approach. I don't have good history with this, with the personal version of... Another stop. She looked faintly annoyed with herself, the expression of someone who can deliver a 90-minute investor presentation without notes and is being defeated by a different kind of sentence. I'm better at the work than at the thing adjacent to the work. I know, he said. You know. You're extremely competent and somewhat avoidant about anything that doesn't have a clear methodology, he said. It's obvious to me, and probably to Alicia, and possibly to Patricia Henshaw. She stared at him. That is a very unkind thing to say. It's accurate. It's unkind and accurate. You prefer inaccurate and kind. I prefer... She stopped, looked at him, and something in her face did the thing it did when she stopped editing. When the competence and the composure parted slightly, and the person underneath came through, the one who rotated wine glasses she didn't drink and said, I'll tell you that later, and called him before a difficult meeting, not for advice, but for the sound of a steady voice. I prefer that you stop being so infuriatingly reasonable about everything. I'll try to be less reasonable, he said. It goes against my nature. I've noticed. He held her gaze. I have a daughter, he said. I'm going to say that first because it's the first thing. She is not a complication for me. She is the central fact of my life. Any version of any personal thing that doesn't include that fact as a given is not a version I can do. I know, she said. You know because I've told you. I know because I've been paying attention, she said. Every conversation we've had, every single one, she's been in it. Not literally, but structurally. The way you build everything around her is... She stopped, and now her expression had something in it he hadn't seen before, something that was not about the foundation or the work or the professional assessment, something quieter and more personal and more careful. It's the thing I noticed before I noticed any of the other things. He was quiet. I'm not uncomplicated either, she said. I should say that clearly. I am extremely good at my work and moderately bad at trusting people with anything that isn't my work, and I have a tendency to solve for independence when I'm uncertain, because independence is a problem I know how to manage. She said it with the directness of someone doing an honest audit. I'm telling you that, so you have accurate information. I have a similar tendency, he said. Mine comes from a different place, but the mechanism is the same. I know. We're both people who got good at not needing things, he said. She looked at him. Yes. That's useful and also a kind of damage, he said. Yes, she said again, softer this time. Outside, the lake sat under the low November sky, enormous, cold, entirely itself. I'd like to do this carefully, he said, not because I'm uncertain, because I have a daughter who's going to form an opinion about this, and her opinion matters to me more than most things, and I'd like her to form it based on something real. That's fair, she said, and I'd like to meet her, she said quietly. He looked at her. You want to meet Gracie? I've been adjacent to her for a month, Isabella said, and there was something almost shy in it, the specific vulnerability of someone who wants something and is not entirely comfortable with how much they want it. She uses the word corroborating. She argues that book authors have twin brothers. She sleeps with one sock on, and you've lost an entire drawer's worth of singles. I feel like I know her already, and I don't, and I'd like to. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, Saturday. She has reading club in the afternoon. After that, she comes home and we make dinner together. She's in charge of pasta. I'm in charge of everything else. It's a division of labor she established at age 6 and has not revisited. You could come for dinner. Isabella looked at him. You're inviting me to dinner. I'm inviting you to witness the pasta division of labor and whatever formal argument she's currently constructing about the twins in her book. I'll bring something, she said. Don't bring wine. Why? She'll ask you why grown-ups drink things that smell like that, and she will wait for a satisfying answer, and there isn't one. Isabella looked at him with that expression, the open one, the one without the management mechanism running. Bring sparkling water? Bring sparkling water, he said. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays do when something is going to happen in them. Unremarkably, in the ordinary sequence of morning light and coffee and a child who woke up at 7:15 with strong opinions about breakfast. Liam hadn't told Gracie who was coming to dinner. He'd said a friend, and she'd looked at him with that evaluating look and said the same friend as before. And he'd said yes, and she'd gone back to her cereal with the expression of someone filing information for later use. He cleaned the apartment in the methodical way of someone who wanted it to look like it hadn't been cleaned specifically for an occasion, which was a contradiction in terms, and he knew it. He moved the stack of library books from the coffee table to Gracie's room. He replaced them with the one book that was supposed to be on the coffee table anyway and had been displaced by the library books for 3 weeks. He stood back and looked at the room, and it looked like someone's real home, which was what he wanted. Isabella arrived at 6:15 with 2 bottles of sparkling water and a box from a bakery she'd passed on the way over, which contained something that smelled extraordinary. She was wearing jeans and a dark sweater, and she'd done her hair in a way that was slightly less precise than usual, slightly more like someone who'd made an effort in a different direction. And she stood in his doorway with the box and the sparkling water and looked, for the first time in his experience of her, genuinely, unmistakably nervous. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. And he felt, in that specific syllable, the whole weight of the journey that had started with that same exchange in a ballroom, the two of them finding each other across the noise, and he held the door open and she came in. Gracie appeared from the hallway at the exact moment Isabella crossed the threshold, because Gracie had, in her 8 years on Earth, developed a preternatural instinct for arrivals. She was wearing the sweater with the small hole at the elbow that Liam kept meaning to mend and hadn't, and her hair was half out of its Saturday braid, and she looked at Isabella with the clear, unhurried assessment of someone who had been given her father's capacity for reading a situation and her own distinct willingness to act on it. "You're the foundation lady," Gracie said. Isabella blinked. "I am." "Daddy has your map on his laptop." "It's our map, technically," Isabella said. "He helped build it." Gracie absorbed this. "I'm Gracie." "I know. I'm Isabella." A pause. Gracie looked at the bakery box. "What's in that?" "Chocolate croissants." I wasn't sure if that was appropriate, so I asked the person at the counter, and they said yes. Gracie's expression performed the difficult task of remaining neutral while in the presence of chocolate croissants. "We're having pasta first," she said. "I was told. I'm in charge of the pasta." "I was told that too." Gracie looked at her father, then back at Isabella. She gave the evaluating nod, the small, considered one that meant she'd reached a conclusion she was keeping mostly to herself. "You can come in," she said, and turned and went back to the kitchen. Liam looked at Isabella. She looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't need a word. Relief, mostly, and the particular species of warmth that comes from watching something delicate land without breaking. "That went," she started. "Don't say well," he said. She pressed her lips together to contain the smile. "It went exactly as the data suggested," she said. He let her in. Dinner was the specific, irreplaceable mess of a meal made by 2 people in a small kitchen with an 8-year-old in charge of the pasta. Gracie had strong opinions about the boiling time, 7 minutes, not 8. 8 makes it sad. And she communicated these opinions with the authority of someone who had conducted extensive research, which she had. Isabella stood at the counter with a glass of sparkling water and watched the process with visible fascination, asking questions that Gracie answered with the brisk efficiency of an expert being consulted. "Why 7?" Isabella said. "Texture," Gracie said. 7 gives you structure. 8 gives you compliance. Liam, at the stove with the sauce, caught Isabella's expression at the word compliance and turned away to manage his own expression. "Where did you learn that?" Isabella said. "Daddy. He says everything worth doing is about understanding the difference between structure and compliance." A pause. "He says that about pasta," Isabella said. "He says that about most things," Gracie said, with the affectionate tolerance of someone who has grown up with a philosopher parent and has made her peace with it. They ate at the kitchen table. The same table where Liam had been doing his thinking since before Gracie could read, the table with the slight wobble from a moved door that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Isabella sat across from Gracie, and Gracie ate her pasta with fork-twirling efficiency and launched, without preamble, into the full formal argument about the twins in her book, which was comprehensive and evidence-based and lasted through the entire pasta course and part of the croissants. Isabella listened with full attention, not the polite attention of an adult enduring a child's monologue, but actual engagement, asking genuine questions, pushing back on one point about the reliability of the narrative evidence in a way that made Gracie narrow her eyes and say, "That's a fair objection," and then spend 4 minutes constructing a counter-argument. Liam ate his pasta and watched them, and felt, with the slow, undeniable completeness of something arriving rather than being reached, what this looked like from the outside. What it was. After dinner, Gracie went to her room to read. Her own choice, made with the discretion of someone who had assessed the room and determined that the adults had things to talk about that didn't require her presence, which was an act of perceptiveness that Liam filed under the ongoing evidence that his daughter saw most things. He washed dishes. Isabella dried them because she'd asked to and he'd let her, and they stood at the sink in the small kitchen in the specific domestic quiet of two people who had found, without quite intending to, that the distance between them had become something neither of them was interested in maintaining. "She argued me to a draw on the twins," Isabella said. "She always argues to a draw minimum, usually to a win. She's going to be terrifying when she grows up." "She's terrifying now," he said. "I say that with complete pride." A pause. The faucet running. The quiet of the apartment around them. "This is good," Isabella said. She wasn't talking about the dish she was drying. She said it simply, without performance, the way you state a fact you've been sitting with long enough to be certain of it. He turned off the faucet. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The weeks that followed had the quality of things being built, not the dramatic, visible construction of something going up fast, but the slower, more durable kind. The foundation's launch was announced in early December, with a press release that Patricia Henshaw's office helped amplify and that landed in financial and community development circles, with the kind of quiet, genuine attention that doesn't make noise immediately, but compounds. The response to the recovery velocity framework was specific and pointed, not universal acclaim, because nothing worth building generates universal acclaim, but the kind of criticism that engages with the substance rather than dismissing the premise, which is the only kind of criticism that tells you you've built something real. 2 researchers at a university in Boston reached out to Alicia asking about the methodology. A community development organization in Detroit sent a letter about a potential regional partnership. A journalist who covered economic inequality wrote a piece about the framework's approach to measuring resilience rather than improvement that was shared more widely than any of them had anticipated. None of it happened cleanly. The Foundation's first grant cycle had an administrative problem that cost 2 weeks of work to resolve. One of the confirmed investors got cold feet in January and took 3 weeks of negotiation to bring back to the table, a process Liam handled with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who understood that the first no in a difficult conversation was usually just the opening position. Christopher Vail's clients launched a minor public critique of the Foundation's model in a trade publication, which was easily countered with data, but required a response, and the response required time that neither Liam nor Isabella had to spare. Derek Solon, in the end, was the least of the consequences Liam had anticipated. When the news of his resignation had reached the firm, Derek had sent a text that said interesting choice with the particular inflection of someone who wanted to express skepticism but had lost the standing to express it with any real force. Liam had read it, understood that it required nothing from him, and deleted it. Whatever came after that, if anything came, he never heard about. Robert Vance's situation was handled by Isabella's lawyer in the methodical, documented way of these things. Formal communications, a settlement of the information-sharing matter, his removal from everything with the kind of clean, complete finality that money and good legal counsel can produce when both are applied with purpose. He issued no public statement. He was not heard from again in any context that touched the Foundation or Hartwell Capital. The structural damage he'd done was real, and it cost time to repair. That was the truth of it, and neither Isabella nor Liam was inclined to soften it into something more comfortable. Real things get damaged by real interference. You account for it, you repair what can be repaired, and you build with the updated information about what's possible. They had the working sessions twice a week, which became 3 times a week through December and into January, which became a rhythm of work and conversation and the gradual, accumulating weight of time spent with someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. Gracie met Isabella 6 more times before January ended. The 7th time, Gracie asked if Isabella was going to keep coming to dinner, in the direct transactional way of someone who wanted to do logistical planning and needed accurate data for it. Liam said he thought so. Gracie said okay and returned to her book. And later that evening, when Liam came to say goodnight, she looked up from her pillow with the expression that meant she'd been thinking about something and had arrived at a conclusion. "She listens when I talk," Gracie said. "I know. Like actually listens. Not like she's waiting for me to finish." "I know." Gracie looked at the ceiling for a moment. "She argued me to a draw about the twins," she said, "but I think she let me have the last point." "Why do you think that?" "Because I could tell she had more," Gracie said simply. He sat on the edge of her bed. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it with the genuine, unhurried consideration she gave to things that mattered. "I think it means she's paying attention," she said. "Not just to the argument, to me." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old and barefoot, and with one sock somewhere in the bedding, and with her mother's eyes, and with a way of seeing things that she'd developed entirely on her own in 8 years of watching her father navigate a life that was sometimes hard and never anything less than fully, presently, intentionally hers. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." She settled into her pillow. "Okay," she said. "Good night." Okay. In February, on an evening that was not remarkable in any of the ways that significant evenings tend to announce themselves, Liam and Isabella sat in the Hartwell Capital conference room after the rest of the staff had gone home, reviewing the second cycle grant applications. The map on the wall had a new addition, a second annotated version beside it, 3 months newer, with a third handwriting on it now that was Liam's, smaller than either of the others, making notes in the margins about the specific zip codes where the recovery velocity data was most granular. The work was real. It was ongoing and imperfect, and occasionally maddening, and it was the kind of work that compounded, that built on itself in the slow, non-linear way of everything worth doing. He understood that now, in a way, he hadn't fully understood it even 6 months ago, because 6 months ago he'd been doing this kind of work alone, at a kitchen table after Gracie fell asleep, and the difference between doing it alone and doing it alongside someone who thinks in the same second-order way, who pushes back on the weak points without softening them, who understands intuitively that the work is the work and not a credential, that difference was not small. Isabella was reading a grant application, her chin in her hand, frowning slightly at something in the financial projections section. She had her shoes off under the table. She had her sleeves rolled up. She had 3 empty coffee cups accumulated at the corner of the table in the way that happened when she was working for more than 4 hours without stopping. She looked up and caught him not working. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at things when she was deciding whether to let them go. She let this one go, which was its own kind of answer, the answer of someone who knows what she's looking at and is not in a hurry. "The West Side application," she said, turning back to the papers. "Their disruption history section is incomplete. They've documented the financial disruptions but not the employment disruptions. They're treating them as separate categories." "They're not separate, miss," he said. "No. Employment disruption precedes financial disruption 70% of the time in the first-year cohort data. I want to send them back a framework question before we score the application." She was already writing on the legal pad. "Does that—" "Yes," he said. She looked up. "I didn't finish the question." "The answer is still yes." She looked at him for a moment with the full, unguarded look that she'd been giving him with increasing frequency since November. The one that arrived before the composure mechanism could catch it. The one that was just her. "You're very strange," she said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." She set down the pen. "Tell me something." "Okay. That first night at the gala, when I walked through the door and Did you know that it was going to become this? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I knew it was something. I didn't know what. What did it feel like? Like a variable I hadn't accounted for, he said. In a calculation I thought I'd already finished. She was quiet for a moment. That's very you, she said. What did it feel like for you? She looked at the map on the wall, the 3 handwriting map, the months of accumulated thinking, the colors and arrows and compressed notation of 2 people who'd been solving the same problem from different directions and had finally found the overlap. Like something clicking into place, she said. Not loudly, just... She made the small clicking gesture with her fingers. That. He looked at her. I still rotate wine glasses I don't drink, she said. I'm still better at the work than at the thing adjacent to the work. I still have trouble with the careful version of sentences. I know, he said, and you're still very practical, he said. Occasionally strange, constitutionally unable to perform either confidence or vulnerability on demand. Yes, she said, and the real smile arrived, the uneven one, the one that started in her eyes and came to her mouth a half-second later with the slight delay of something that hadn't been rehearsed. All of that. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not dramatically, not with any of the performed weight that the gesture can carry when it's doing too much work. Just the plain, simple fact of his hand on hers, warm and present and certain. She turned her hand over. That was all. That was enough. Some things don't need more than that. There are people who will tell you that worth is visible, that you can see it in what a person has, what they wear, who they arrive with, how much space they take up in a room. These people are not entirely wrong. Worth is visible, but they're looking at the wrong surfaces. What Liam Parker had learned across 8 years of quiet, deliberate, unglamorous work, at kitchen tables and library sessions, and in the margins of financial documents that no one else was going to read, was that worth is built in the accumulation of private choices. The choices you make when no one is watching, and there is no credential to be gained, and the only return is the knowledge that you did the thing because it needed doing, and you were the person who could do it. He'd believed that for years without having anyone to believe it alongside him. What Isabella Hartwell had learned across 6 years of building things in rooms where she was underestimated, of watching capital move toward familiarity rather than evidence, of being called difficult for being correct, was that the clearest signal of a person's character is not what they do when opportunity arrives, but what they do when it doesn't. When the visibility is absent, when the press release is not forthcoming, when the work has no audience. She'd been looking for that signal for a long time. She found it in a man in a 3-year-old suit carrying a coat check ticket, standing at the exit of a ballroom he'd decided to leave before anyone could see him leave. He hadn't been waiting to be found. That was the thing. He'd been building, quietly, steadily, in the particular patient way of someone who understood that real things take real time and require real presence, regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. He wasn't doing it to be seen. He was doing it because that was who he was. The people who mocked him that night remembered the ballroom. They remembered Isabella's arm through his, the silence that fell, the specific humiliation of being the loud voice in a room that has just learned it was wrong. Some of them told the story for months afterward, framing it in different ways depending on who they were telling it to. But the through line was always the same. They had misjudged. They had looked at a man and seen only the surface of him and concluded that the surface was the whole. That was always the error. Not malicious most of the time, just human. The natural laziness of an eye that learns to sort quickly and stops looking deeper once it thinks it has what it needs. What Isabella had that they didn't was the habit of looking deeper, of finding the work that was done without the press release, of understanding that the quiet signal, carefully followed, tells you more than the loud one. What Liam had, that he'd never thought of as a gift, was the capacity to keep building in the dark. To do the right thing at the kitchen table at midnight with no audience and no return except the thing itself. To care about Gracie's stability more than his own pride. To call Isabella immediately when Vale's call came in, because the alternative, so even the possibility of the alternative, was not something he could hold in his hands and recognize as himself. Those things were not impressive on the surface. They never are. but they were the structure of him, and structures in the end are what hold. Gracie Parker grew up in a household that had, in the space of one winter, become larger and warmer than it had been. Not because everything became easy, but because the loneliness that had lived in the apartment's quiet edges had been replaced with something better and more complicated. She grew up watching two adults work on something they believed in, argue about methodology on Tuesday evenings, lose their patience with each other occasionally, and find it again, make dinner in a small kitchen, and eat at a table with a wobble that eventually got fixed. She grew up knowing, with the particular bone-deep certainty of a child who has been given the actual evidence of it, that the way her father lived was worth something, that the choices made in the dark, without applause, without recognition, compound, that worth is not assigned by the rooms you walk into. She already knew that on some level before any of it happened. She'd always known it. She'd told him so in the hallway, the night of the gala, in the vocabulary available to her then, which was the vocabulary of an 8-year-old examining her father's suit from every angle and delivering her verdict with the solemnity of someone who meant it entirely. "You look handsome, Daddy." And then, because she was herself, and always had been, mostly. He'd laughed. He was still carrying the warmth of it. He always would be.